This is our mine. We don't leave unless we know why.
You're going to Chernobyl. Do you know what's happened there?
Are you sure this is the Minecraft movie? All right, we're back. And we're not talking about a new movie this weekend.
Or a movie at all.
We're talking about something that was on my watch list for a while. Because I saw this miniseries. Well, I didn't see it, but I saw that it had come out in 2019. I was like, oh, that's something I would like to watch one day. And I finally got around to it. And then I saw you had also seen it previously. And just kind of going through it, I was like, this actually feels like something I really want to share and talk about a bit.
Yeah.
And so I figured as good a time as any.
Yeah, no, I mean, this early April release calendar is a little bit dire, so sometimes you just gotta pull from the past.
So, this series, we're talking about HBO's 2019 series Chernobyl. It follows, as you might imagine, the events of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster from the 1980s. And so it starts with the reactor explodes and everyone's scrambling to kind of pick up the pieces, clean it up. What are we going to do about it? And then it starts to pivot into, well, how did it happen in the first place? You know, what was the human error that caused it? And also, what was the institutional rot that allowed such a thing to happen? And trying to uncover that is the central drama of the series.
Yeah, I think, so it's a 5-episode miniseries, which is about the only way you'll get me to commit to TV, because I have major commitment anxiety for that kind of thing. But, you know, as we kind of go through it, I think it does a really excellent job of taking a very complicated, multifaceted chapter of history and sort of coming up with a very clear and concise way of sort of charting a course through it. It starts out as kind of almost a horror film in a way, and then it pivots to becoming more of like a mix of, you know, political thriller in a sense and a courtroom drama. And so, you know, is this the totality of the story? You know, not really, but I don't think you can expect that of something like this. And it just finds ways to look at little bits of this and then kind of extrapolate outward and paint a larger picture.
That's something that I really admire about it, because it is a very much kind of like an epic length account of what happened. And it's pretty easy for us to summarize. Like, I just did it, and you got kind of like the gist of what happens. But the show also goes through and it branches off in little ways. It'll show us like scenes of how individual people living in this region are being impacted by it. And each little narrative we get, like, it'll be, you know, maybe just one scene, or maybe they'll just appear in one episode. Maybe they don't get named at all. But each account we get of that helps to paint the larger picture of what's going on, how it has impacted people's lives. And I think that's just structured and written, put together exceedingly well.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that, because you mentioned that it opens like a horror movie, and I really liked that decision, because it feels, it's not just like, oh, it's scary. It uses almost the visual language of like a horror monster movie. Especially like near the end of the second episode, there's this upcoming crisis where the entire plant is going to have a second explosion unless they send in 3 guys to basically go on what's believed to be a suicide run,
right,
to drain the water from beneath the reactors. And as they're going in, it's like they have the Geiger counter with them. I forget the name that they use in the series, but like and just it's clicking faster and faster. The lights are starting to go out, and music's getting, not even the music, it's just
there's
the
no
counter
music
clicking
at all.
faster, faster, faster. And the episode ends with the last light cutting out. It's cliffhanger, and it's exactly what you would see in a horror movie before the monster pounces, right?
Yeah, except this monster you can't see at all. And yeah, I think this does a really excellent job as we kind of step our way through it, but just talking sort of big picture, it kind of really, the creative team and the direction and whatnot really does a good job of saying, okay, what stylistically do I need for this moment? Something like you're talking about, which is very kind of visceral and intense, or how am I going to shoot a courtroom sequence and kind of this interpersonal uncertainty that's unfolding, etc. So it really does a good job of pivoting and finding the right energy for the scene while keeping this still feeling very kind of connected and singular.
You know, kind of like as a side thing, because again, we're talking about this as a horror movie. Did you ever see that there's like a Chernobyl horror movie that got released
the like,
in, like
Chernobyl
early
Diaries
2010s?
or whatever?
Yeah.
I have not.
Like, I've seen like some clips from it. It doesn't look like a good movie anyways.
No.
But also it just feels like something kind of like, I don't know, like gouge to make something like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit kind of like, oh, this tragedy. We are, getting up on 40 plus years distance, so I guess time heals all wounds or whatever. Yeah, it is a little iffy.
Yeah, like I'm not being like, oh, it's like it's offensive or anything. It's just kind of like, a movie where it's like, oh, they got exposed to the radiation and they turned into monsters.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, the real horror here is institutional neglect. Thank you very much.
No, the only one I saw was that really awful, the Dyatlov Pass bears only similarity in name and not that person who's the figure in Chernobyl, but there's this like, there's a incident that happened there, it's called like Devil's Pass or something. At the end of it, it's like interdimensional bullshit. You're just like, I hate found footage so much. They never like quite stick the landing.
It's like one movie did it well. People are like, oh, did people like the way it was like kind of grounded and like, left things vague? No, we gotta just make it crazy. But anyway, back on topic here. What we see in this series is honestly more horrific than like any kind of like mutant creature could ever be. I think it was episode 4 when it's showing people in the hospital and how they're literally falling apart from the radiation poisoning.
That really impacts the community in very extreme and visceral sense.
It's so easy to get into the shoes like so many characters within this series where you're a firefighter, you show up to the plant and you're like, oh gee, what's this stuff, I'll move this out of the way, and not knowing minutes later your hand's going to be like imploding on itself because because you weren't told the truth of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the initial the opening of this series and kind of how we step into it all, the emphasis is really strongly on, even before we get to kind of like the party end of things, it's like, this is something that is fundamentally alien for everyone involved. The plant has an explosion, certainly, industrial accidents are fortunately rare, but they're not something that we've never seen before, right? But so you show up, you're a firefighter, you're responding to, a fire, and there's all of the hallmarks of something that you've done before in some sense, and yet there are these horrible, this ionizing radiation and everything that's going to fundamentally and quickly affect your entire life. You have people, just watching from a distance, and they're just like, well, there's this fire going on or whatever, and everyone kind of rubbernecks during anything as small as a car accident. You pass it on the highway and you're what's going on over there, except again, you have this fallout that's going to impact you and in life, ending ways. So it's like, how do we deal with this? How are we going to respond to something that is, as they say, never happened before? That's
the line. Because, we follow these characters. You have scientist who comes in. He's like pretty much. He's like, hey, you're just going to look at this little thing here. And he quickly becomes kind of like the head of the cleanup here. Because he's like, no, like, this is serious. And the guy who's with him, Sherbina, who's the one party member who actually will listen to him and be like, yeah, I'll get you what you need because I fully understand the scope of the situation. It's like as they are, they're talking about, and it's really kind of, again, it's sold so well. Like, you really feel that sense when he's like, no, this has never happened before. We need to figure out what to do here. And I don't know. The series is really good at hitting all of the points, all of the emotional beats that it wants to. Yeah, because I think in terms of explaining what's going on and explaining how are we going to respond to this, they do a good job of our central, I would say, trio essentially would be, Valery Legasov, the scientist that you mentioned, who kind of is brought on to kind of initially just sort of rubber stamp whatever. He sees things that are deeply concerning to him and ends up kind of trying to put pressure on. You have Boris Sherbina, who is within the party mechanism, but does come to become more of an advocate for Legasov. And then you have Ilona Khomyuk, who is an exterior nuclear physicist who is over in Belarus and sees things in her own lab and is like, what the hell's going on? And so we have these central figures who will guide us through the main central thrust of the crisis, while allowing for kind of satellite stories to talk about all of the other human stories kind of unveiling around this crisis response and then investigation. And again, that's something that the series handles really well, because we get because we get this really good drama between the characters. Because at first, you're saying, Legasov he's brought on, very narrow role, and Sherbina, he's like, no, you're just gonna do this. But when they get there, Sherbina starts to see that things aren't looking quite right, and he starts deferring more and more to Legasov, where he's like, he starts asking questions like, how do you know what's on the roof actually? To the plant manager there, and they're like, and it's kind of, it's a point where there is a little bit of levity to it, because they start turning to each other like, yeah, how do you know that? Yeah, how do we know that? And again, it's something that adds that little bit of levity, but also serves to show the kind of the chain of command that people just put their blind faith in. It's like, well, the next guy said it's okay, so we'll just do it. That helped lead to the disaster happening and the disaster worsening. Right. I think what it does, what's really interesting to watch in all of this developing situation is what it really starts to drill in on and then kind of look at from various angles, like you're saying, people deferring responsibility or people kind of just going with what someone else says just because it's easier or they claim authority, is all of the ways and all of the institutional ways that we can react defensively. And you have certain people at the plant who don't want to be painted in a negative light, so they become incredibly negative. You have the party, which is, again, there's this foundational sort of denial of problems and all of these different, and then you start to have Legasov, who presents kind of as a at least initially a kind of a
a challenge to that. And then you have Sherbina, who starts to see that and initially has a gut reaction of like, just shut up. But then starts to say, wait a minute, like, you know, he begins to question, like, what is our threshold for just accepting, and what is our threshold for like challenging something that we believe to be wrong for, you know, be it like ethical reasons, be it for specific knowledge or what have you. And I think to that end, like, the performances are great, you know, top to bottom, but I really like Stellan Skarsgård brings such an interesting energy to Boris Sherbina. Like, he starts out as very much that kind of just like politician, essentially. He's got this like charisma of power to him, and the way that he can kind of just be like, yeah, you know, he's talking with Gorbachev and just kind of being like, yeah, it's fine, it's whatever, 3.4 Runkins, not great, not terrible, it'll be fine, it'll be, you know, a long weekend and we're done, and is very antagonistic towards Legasov. But then he does start to, you see these like inner fissures that start to form within him for various reasons. You get his sense of mortality becomes really shaken once he knows that even being in that contaminated area will increase his risk for cancer, or his kind of, it's very ambiguous, but his kind of changing relationship to the Soviet power structure at large seems to kind of shift over the course of the series, and it's just really subtle work.
Yeah, there's one scene where, because again, you know, it starts off, he's very much a party man, and near the end where, you know, they're trying to clear off the roof, and they get a robot in from Germany, and they're like, oh yeah, they, you know, this can totally, you know, this can handle the radiation. They send it out there, within seconds it's fried, and it's because when the state had reached out and said, hey, we need some help, can you get us a robot with these specifications, they used the propaganda numbers and not the real numbers. So they just flushed all that money and credibility down the drain anyways. Like, they used the propaganda numbers and then it didn't work anyways. And he calls Moscow, and you can just hear him, like, everyone's kind of waiting outside, like everyone's just like kind of like staring as he is furious on the phone. Like he I think he throws something, right? He throws,
just completely destroys the telephone.
Yeah,
just beats the shit out of it. And then asks for
like, it's again, it's these points where the series does have those moments of levity, and I think it does it really well, because it's not just like, you know, you don't need a jokey character come in and be like, oh, well, that just happened.
He's right behind me, isn't he?
Turn around, see elephant's foot.
Oh, God.
But again, like, it's because it's written well, it's still able to find those moments where just the absurdity of the situation, the absurdity that the state is so obsessed with keeping up its image that it does things that end up blowing up its image anyways.
Right.
You know, it serves the theme of the story.
And its absurdity in the face of, at least in the first half or so, the series, where we're dealing with the, how do we, you know, stop this problem? It's needless lying and self-denial in the face of like a series of events that will not take into consideration the politics of the series. You know, okay, we have to, you know, stop the fire and put that out. Okay, is that taken care of? Great. Well, now, you know, this material is gonna melt down. How do we resolve that? If not, you know, massive explosion of God on like crazy scale. Okay, we've got that dealt with. How are we gonna like deal with this massive, you know, exclusion zone that's been irradiated? You know, and all of this stuff. None of the human mechanisms here, nothing is going to change that. It's only how they respond to it which matters.
Yeah, and just seeing how bit by bit the state says, goes from, okay, this didn't happen, to, okay, it happened, but it's not that bad, to, okay, it is that bad, but it's taken care of now, to, everybody, you have to leave your houses immediately. Here come the buses.
Mm-hmm.
I've really loved that scene, by the way, with the evacuation of Pripyat.
Mm-hmm.
And just the way that it starts is very... There's just something about that shot where... Because it focuses on a couple of people who pulled over by the road. I think they're just like they're on their bikes. I think they're fixing their car or something. You know, they're just having a normal day. And then in the distance, it's kind of like shimmering with the heat on the road.
Mm-hmm.
But you see the buses start to turn the corner. And then the department's like, oh, what's going on? You see the buses go by. And, you know, the evacuation starts unfolding. And it's one of those things where these huge life-changing events will just, you know, can come at any time, at any day, you know. It could be that the stock market has a historic meltdown just on a random Thursday.
Who could have foreseen that?
You know, but, you know, things like that, or, and I think also, if this had come out after 2020, I would say it's almost on the nose in commenting on the COVID response here in the United States.
Yeah.
But again, this came out 2019.
Just before it. There's not going to be a major... Well, I mean, I guess the difference is on some level, they listen to the scientists on a maybe a little more comprehensive level here, even if it was politicked to death in the end. But yeah, that sequence with the you know, the kind of acknowledgement that they are going to evacuate is the series does a really good job of like, how do we introduce a change like that? Like, rather than just having someone be like, okay, now roll out the buses, you know, you have this like, again, and you're put into the perspective of this motorcycle couple, and it's this totally weird thing that they have no idea what's going on, and so it builds in this the lack of like direct acknowledgement by leadership. They're going to do this evacuation, but they're not gonna, you know, it's still kind of veiled and whatnot, and then it's this strange circumstance that's coming out of nowhere, as you say. So how can you build that into the language of your film? And that's one way. And I think that an interesting through line, both from some kind of recurring characters and also just events like this, it really emphasizes the scale of the toll on just working people throughout this entire crisis. You have people that are living in Pripyat, they have to move with zero notice. You have the plant workers that you mentioned earlier who have to go into contaminated water and turn you know, like open the sluice gates so that, you know, we don't explode the entire region or what have you. And you know, that gets kind of a sort of like noble sacrifice element to it, you could say, but it's very much kind of put onto them. And it's these working class laborers who are expected to do that because of the nature of the knowledge that they have. And then you have this similar situation unfolding time and again when they need to dig out tunnels so they can install heat exchangers later on after this immediate crisis has passed. Who has to do that? Miners, because of their skill set, but they're expected to then, you know, essentially put themselves at risk for cancer and radiation poisoning, etc. You know, but they're these workers and stuff, and you have this disconnect between the people who are making the decisions and then asking for other people to do it for them. And there's this kind of, you know, sort of stratification that's formed in this country and this system that venerates the worker
for the happiness of all mankind.
Mm-hmm. There's a deep, painful irony to the whole thing.
That whole episode with that has that title there, absolutely incredible. It's like, this is the reason why a lot of stuff that I write, like, I'm I don't think I've ever said this before, like on the thing. I'm like, yeah, I'm writing a book. But I like writing these kind of like social drama kind of a things because I find it so fascinating to see, you know, this thematic through line, and then with a story like this, you don't just have the main characters. It's not just the gossip, Shabina, Komyuk, Dyatlov, like all like the people making the decisions. You have hundreds, thousands of people who you have to paint some picture of in the background.
Right.
And in that episode, For the Happiness of All Mankind, it opens with this old woman that we will never see again, with a soldier telling her she has to evacuate. And in this scene, you know, she's milking her cow. She's not paying this guy any attention. And she just goes through, you know, when I was a little girl, there's the Tsar, his men came, they pushed us around, and then the Civil War came, Bolsheviks terrorized us, and then Great War came, the Germans came in, terrorized us, you know, and now all this time we are still here. I am not leaving my house. And it's those little flourishes that really give you the idea of where the national spirit is, basically.
Right.
And you can really get the sense that, and this is something that I kind of surprised me when I was watching this, because I always, you know, I knew about Chernobyl, like the basics of like, oh yeah, it's like it happened towards like the end of the Soviet Union, but it really struck me how it was just a few years before the whole system fell apart.
Right.
Before the Soviet Union dissolved. And you get the sense in the air that, yeah, the machinery is having trouble keeping things going. And people, the way that people are acting, the way that they talk about things, you just get the sense that like something's not working. That a big engine somewhere is starting to sputter.
It balances those really well. Like, and it, I don't know, I think it comes across in this kind of economy of storytelling. I think that you can take things that elsewhere might look a little trite and use it as a gesture to kind of symbolize this larger structure. Like, you know, with these miners, for example, when they're told to, okay, here's your next job, they all end up like, it's this, you know, local minister or whatnot, I forget his title, but you know, he shows up in his suit and stuff, and they all end up, as they kind of, after acknowledging that, yeah, okay, this is what's going on, like they all, like as they walk past, they all kind of smear their coal, their soot on his immaculate jacket and kind of sully him, like it's their blood on his hand, on, you know, on him in a certain sense. And like handled incorrectly, that could come off as so like pat, you know, save the cat cheesy screenwriting, but it just works. And it, like, when you see that gesture, you're like, okay, this is speaking to the greater situation, and this is a specific crisis, but it's very much symptomatic of an entire political system and social structure, you know, that then gets kind of starts to be explicitly addressed when they're going through and accounting for responsibility for this whole situation.
Something that I really do admire with this series is that, because obviously, as we've been describing, it has a lot to say about the people in power and how they mishandle the situation so badly for their own benefit.
Right.
But it really does a lot to show how, you know, everyday people who were called upon, you know, like, it's time to make another great sacrifice for the motherland. You know, it's like they weren't happy about it, but they did it.
Right.
They did what they had to do to help keep the crisis contained once the state agreed that it had to be contained. You know, there's a lot of people who, you know, not just the people who got, you know, the acute radiation poisoning, but the people who, you know, had to take time of lives, who had to become killers. You know, like you have there's, you know, soldier who, he's not even a soldier. Like, he gets put into the army. It's like, okay, yeah, you have to go around. Your job is you have to put down all the cats and dogs that people left behind because they have radiation in them.
Right.
That, and just that, now that's something that he ends up having to live with. That's like a whole little arc in an episode of just because people at the top couldn't run things correctly. This is what he has to deal with in his life now.
Right.
And on a related note, I've also seen a lot of people praise not just the higher machinations of everything, but also just the way that it captured the feeling of living in the Soviet Union at that time. A lot of people who did live in that area said that it was a very faithful recreation.
Yeah, making sure it feels right.
Right. It's, again, I really like a lot of stuff like this. There's another mini series actually that I either want to make a video on, we might do a podcast episode on, called Burning Bush.
Okay.
Which kind of has like similar themes, but it takes place in Prague, around the time that the
Prague Spring.
The Prague Spring. That's something of I was like, it wasn't Velvet Revolution, it wasn't Springtime of Peoples, Prague Spring, yes. And it's about basically like those demonstrations and everything, and how the Soviet repression took place there.
It's interesting.
It's a very particular mini genre that I'm into, I guess.
I think another thing that the series does well, especially kind of in the back half, is sort of like looking at how difficult it can be to resist or to speak out in a fundamentally oppressive system. Like, I would say in his initial our initial impression of Legasov is something of kind of like an imperfect dissident. He pushes back when everything is like, okay, we're just going to be fine, it'll be whatever, and he says, no, I'm really concerned about the graphite on the roof. That means that this situation is far worse than our initial reports are indicating, and he makes a pain of himself, but like because of that and because of the kind of relationship he builds with Shabina, like starts to get this going in the right direction. But you can also see how much of a burden this is for him, and he's not like this, like this kind of, God, what is that? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Like, he doesn't, like, he has speeches, and when we get to the testimony, like, he does have things to say, but he's also got some things that are, it's very difficult for him, and he also has some things that are a little bit more kind of negative, which make him much more interesting in his imperfection. Like, when they are looking to how do we, the robot that you mentioned failed, their lunar rover is like trying its damnedest but not doing very well. He's the first to suggest sending people up onto the roof to push off the thing, and he even refers to them as bio-robots, so it kind of dehumanizes the effort in a sense. It's a very analytical response, but it's also kind of cold, so I think having these ideas, and then him struggling when he is being put to testify about the narrative, essentially, like after all is said and done, what happened, and who's accountable, he struggles to kind of give the totality of it, because there are things that the party want to hear in terms of, we have, 3 people who are responsible for this, but there's also going to be elements that indicate failure on an institutional level, and that is really difficult for him to do.
Right. And it's very difficult as well when the whole system seems to be in line with the party. And this is something that gets presented because if he speaks out and he says, it's like, is that going to change anything? Like, it depends on the other people in the room, the other physicists who are there, the other engineers hearing this. It's depending on them to then to stick out their necks to put pressure to say, hey, let's not put fuel on the tips of our control rods anymore. And that's kind of like a gamble in itself. Are you going to throw away your entire life, your well-being, your legacy, everything to maybe make things better?
Right.
And I'd like to think that if I was given that chance, and I think everybody would like to picture that, given the opportunity, you would do the right thing. But when it is your life, your family, your career, your well-being, everything that you have in your life on the line, that's difficult to decide then.
Right. And even on a discourse level, I think it's interesting to see how people, even independent of any kind of like consequence, react to either criticism or being told they're wrong or what have you. Like, if you think about when Legasov is trying to figure out how to kind of contain and control this whole situation, and Khomyuk has figured out elsewhere that there's a severe problem structurally, and she manages to get into the whole thing. And when she tells Legasov that he's wrong about something, that he's missed a detail, his initial response is to be dismissive, and I think that's what we all do. We've thought through all of this, and we're correct and whatnot. But like, he then listens, and they have a conversation, and they talk through the issue. Whereas the situation that led to this whole disaster is a middle manager who knows fuck all, becoming a tiny little tyrant and pushing people into a situation with which they are uncomfortable and with which they cannot voice their own, and they cannot have a discussion even on a safety level. And so, again, it's kind of these little miniature, like in the latter case it's a power structure, in the former case it's a discussion. Like, how does this, like, fundamentally human interaction, how does this impact, in this case, the course of events that are a major chapter in history?
I got Paul Ritter as Anatoly Dyatlov, the engineer. Oh my god, what's like, he is a perfect scumbag. Like, oh my god. I was just like, I was like, dude, no wonder this thing melted down with you at the helm. Jesus Christ.
If I can say, there is one, like, or not one, like, his whole, like, personal attacks on every level is like, yeah, but I have found that if someone in that situation refers to, like, instrumentation or equipment or whatever as quote unquote mine, they don't know what the hell they're talking about, and they are underqualified.
Yeah, because you work with lab equipment and everything. Like,
I don't work with a nuclear reactor, but sometimes the mass specs treat me like shit. So, yeah.
It's but yeah, like, it's, again, every emotional beat that the series tries to hit, it pulls off so well. I'm just like, yeah, and it's, because at the end, in the big trial where the party's like, yes, these three made this happen and we will punish them now. It's like, you can kind of see, it's like, this guy did a good job of making himself a scapegoat, because he is, like, at least, like, what, 90% responsible for it.
Oh, yeah.
Like, another thing that I do like with this series is that it also, because in the ending, it ends with kind of like a slideshow of, like, the real people and everything. And I like that it also comes clean about ways that it kind of like reworked stuff for the narrative. Like, Ilona Khomyuk was not a real person. She's kind of an aggregate of the many scientists who
Right.
came to Chernobyl to figure out what to do, what was going on. And when you're telling a narrative, it makes sense to kind of have a single character who can do all these roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that Chernobyl said, like, yes, we did this, but here's all the people that she represents that really existed.
Yeah, I think within a narrative like this, a historical accounting in a narrative way or whatever, like, it really deviation. I'm not gonna ding something like this. Like, it'd be completely ludicrous to have however many people, like, just from an audience perspective, and like,
yeah,
deviation like that. It comes down to intent, really. In this case, it was as a way to streamline ideas, to get the thrust of what do we want to talk about as far as the actual thing that happened. What do we want to talk about as far as, which is in this case far more interesting to me. I care more about using this story to dissect power dynamics and to dissect kind of how do people respond to this, and how can they work within this system or try to break the system in order to achieve something. That's the real end goal for me, as compared to like other, like you could look at a Bohemian Rhapsody or whatever, where the decisions are made where you can tell that they're protecting someone, like all the members of Queen want to make themselves look good or whatever, and the editor wants to cut as many times as they possibly can. Like, that is disingenuous and it's dishonest, whereas something like this is saying, okay, there's no way we can tell the totality of this. How can we be as true to what we're trying to say here as possible? It's not a documentary. I would hold that to a different standard.
Right, this is very much a dramatization, and like I said, like, I like that, because even if they hadn't outright said like, oh, this, she's an aggregation of all the other scientists, I was still like, yeah, like, it makes sense for that to do that for the story. I just appreciate that they went that extra mile to say this is a change that we made within the text itself.
Right, and it's nice to kind of have that acknowledgement.
Yeah. And it is really fascinating to see how there's something very universal about what happened here. Because when it comes down to it, the accident was caused, one, by a reactor that didn't work the way that people were told it would work because the state wanted to cut corners on construction. Again, whose government hasn't cut corners to save some money before? Let's be real. But also, the actual direct cause for the event was, we're going to run a reckless safety test so that my boss's boss can get promoted, so my boss can get promoted, so I can get promoted. And that's not something that is unique to the Soviet Union. That is, again, a universal experience. Mm-hmm. Somebody in an institution is going to bend the rules, is going to do something unsafe because there's something in it for them. And also just there's something about, again, the most potent scenes for me are the ones where people go in and they're doing what they think is the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And it ends up getting them killed. Because it's, obviously nobody would actually, nobody's going to say, oh, I trust the government. The only people who do that are the people who are in the government, right? Mm-hmm. But at some level, as we're talking right now, if somebody started pounding on your door, at your place, saying they're going to kill you, what are you going to do? You're going to call 911, right? Because you trust that someone is going to be sent to help you. Right. It's like, eventually. We have some level of trust that when we turn on a water faucet, water's going to come out of there. At some level, the world, the power, we turn on a switch, power is going to come on. When you go outside, the air, you can breathe it and reasonably be healthy, unless you get what I'm saying.
Right.
And so to have something that happened where the state says, where some institution says, things are okay and they're not okay. That is something that is just deeply unsettling about. And yeah, it's a very powerful series, very powerful story. I'm glad I finally saw it. Like, I've been raving about this in real life to people. I'm like, oh, I just saw this and it's great. You should watch it.
No, it really just works on all levels. Yeah, it's interesting to think about and engage with on institutional levels. You talk about it's just also really like white knuckle right all the way through, just as a narrative. If we're just totally fictional, it'd be engaging on that front.
Absolutely fantastic. One of my new favorite things that I've seen. Oh, and also we have to talk about the music.
Hildur
so this, yes, is like she. I don't think this is like her first one, but I think this is like the first like big like mainstream work that she did.
Yeah, this was how I first heard about her prior to, Joker.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna make that joke. Where I was like, and then later that year she was a Joker, and she won the Oscar for that. So I mean, she got an award, which is nice, but God, her compositions for this movie, this like industrial, you feel it, and it's used in a way that's very effective, like at just the right points to accentuate. Oh my God, very good.
Yeah, I think it fits the mood. I think the series also knows when not to use it, like when you reference the whole sequence in the dark, like the complete absence of score is really effective in that. But she does know how to kind of add that extra like zhuzh that just really sets things on edge. But like in the conclusion in that epilogue you mentioned, she sets the Vichnaya Pamya, which is like a Eastern Orthodox hymn. I think it's from the Requiem Mass. I don't remember off the top of my head, but she does this really, it's gorgeous and it feels very apropos for the the kind of memorial nature of the what they're kind of tolling out. But she does such an interesting job of kind of marrying the sound vocabulary of the kind of Orthodox liturgical music to a more contemporary kind of choral angle, with kind of like having these choral structures and building in this like clustering of sound that feels a bit of a part or evocative of her earlier work. And it's really moving, and yeah, I think it's really an important and impactful aspect of the whole show.
Did you have any other points you wanted to hit before we wrapped up?
I think that's most. I do remember. I really like. Of all things, I don't know why I wrote this down, but the like weird Soviet like public art I'm obsessed with. Like with the introduction of that like Belarusian atomic institution that Homyuk is like at, like it is just like two rip dudes like smashing open an atom with sledgehammers and mosaic. I'm like, this is rad. Like, more of this, please.
Is that the same genre that I saw this in a meme once? So like, there's like is a medical thing, and it's like this again shirtless ripped guy with like a Hermes staff with one hand, and then a hand extended pushing away the Grim Reaper.
It's like very much that energy, and we're like, this just didn't need to go as hard as it did.
It's the one good thing, the one good legacy of the Soviet Union, I guess.
Shostakovich, I don't know.
But yeah, it was a great series, and I hope that writer Craig Mazin goes on to some really great projects.
Why do I get a forbidding feeling about that?
Anyways, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you want to see more of us, I'm Daniel Goldhorn on YouTube.
And I'm Reynard /cinema on Tumblr.
We'll see you all next time. You take care.
Bye.